snacks. This is in celebration of Darrell's retirement, and actually her last day with us today. So next week. Okay, well good. One more. Nonetheless, that's an exciting adventure. So
one last.
Oh, good.
All right. In addition to that, Mark's teaching in another classroom today, so we have the pleasure of having Ryan with us today.
Mark never gets that.
My goodness.
I think most of us know, but Ryan's one of our residents, so anybody that's maybe new to the class today, he's going to be filling in there, but we have the pleasure of hearing him on the chancel and at Vespers and filling in like this. So we're starting a new study, and we'll get started, and we'll remember we do prayer time at the end. Terry has an announcement.
Yes, this is the last Sunday for the coats, and we have made our goal of 50 coats. And they're going to be.
I'm just going to scream a lot this morning.
Shelter tomorrow. Thank you so much.
Anything else? All right, Ryan, it's your show.
Sure. Probably later. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to be with you, as always. I'll say a couple of announcements myself, because it's what I'm doing in worship in an hour, so I'll practice with you all. Just remember the hanging of the green is this evening, and that'll be a really meaningful time. And then if you haven't picked up your Advent devotional from the front office, it's also online, so you can just get on your computer and look at it through Facebook and the website. But many of us contributed to this, myself included, the other residents, lots of church members. So a nice daily devotion guide through the season of Advent. Actually, beyond the season of Advent, it started last week, with Advent starting officially today. But will guide us all the way through Christmas. So, theme of rejoice, and so there's almost 28 days of that guiding us through to Christmas. And I think that's it. But let me say quickly that since the last time I was with you,
Totally interrupt you, I'm so sorry. Will that be someone jazzing in? Sorry.
yeah,
Advent of Jazz, the festival starts Tuesday, so please come out every Tuesday up through Christmas. The Wallace and Williams and Wallace Christmas, two outstanding singers. The second one on the 11th is Damon Clark, who is also a member of the Dallas Opera, and you never know what he's going to do. Really good. And then we'll close it out with Joe McBride, who was our season closer last season. So if you like him, you'll like him.
Every Tuesday?
Every Tuesday through, right to the one before, the last Tuesday before Christmas. So like it'll be next week.
6 or 6:30?
Next week.
6:30.
what time?
7. Starts at
7.
7.
Okay. Get here at 6:30.
Starts at 7. And this Tuesday, if anybody wants to greet, please let me know. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to make it. I've got a colonoscopy.
No, that's great. Anything else?
Not that you have the phone.
No. The announcement. Not your but since I was with you last, we journeyed to the Holy Land and back. We being the residents, and George, and several church members, and a few from Temple Emmanuel, the Jewish synagogue in town. And you will get to hear more about that from us in February, I believe. We are doing Tales from the Holy Land on Wednesday night. I think that's right. So we get a chance with George to talk about what we learned, what we experienced. But it's interesting to me that already in thinking about Advent, reading through some of the gospel stories, thinking of Nazareth and Bethlehem and Galilee and these places that they talk about through the story of Jesus, we were just there a couple of weeks ago, and so how that shapes our perspective. And so I'll talk more about that as we go today, but just know that you'll get to hear from us later about that. But today is the first Sunday of Advent. It begins this season, and many of you will know that I, in my previous life, was a youth minister. And so I worked with people much younger than you. No offense. Much younger than me, too.
We don't act your age.
What's that?
Don't act your age.
Yeah, age is just a number, right? one of the things that I would always do with my teenagers, with our youth group, I would do some trivia related to different liturgical seasons. And so I wanted to start with you all, testing your Advent knowledge, if that's fair to do. Even if it's not fair, I'm going to do it anyway. But we're just going to do very quickly some Advent trivia that I've put together. Again, this is something I use with some of our youth. It's not that difficult, but just see what it is that you know or don't know about this season of Advent. So the season of Advent starts today, and in the church liturgical calendar, so the seasons of the church year, Lent, Advent, Christmas, Pentecost, all those things, they have liturgical colors that go with them. So the first question is, what is the liturgical color for the season of Advent? Purple, or sometimes pink is included, sometimes blue. Certain traditions liturgically will use blue for the season of Advent. Most use the color of purple, which we also use for Lent. There is a particular Sunday, which we'll get to in a minute, in which pink is used during Advent. But the official liturgical color for the season of Advent is purple. This is a true or false question for you. True or false? The season of Advent lasts for 40 days. False. Why is that false? Because that's...
Sunday isn't counted.
Well, we're 40 days, not including Sunday, is actually the season of Lent.
Okay.
So the season of Advent is actually just the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas.
If I heard BBC correct this morning, this
Okay.
is also the first day of Hanukkah. Is there any connection?
And so I would have to go back and try to remember. I don't.
But then Hanukkah actually follows like some sort of, it doesn't always follow at the same time because it follows something about the moon or the
It's
star.
lunar. It's lunar, whereas
They go by lunar calendar when we go by solar.
well, and ours is right. Ours is the 4 Sundays. Ours being Advent is the 4 Sundays preceding Christmas. Christmas is always December 25th, so you just always back out the 4 Sundays before. Whereas I'd say I have to learn more. I don't remember all the details of Hanukkah, but theirs is on a lunar. Theirs is lunar, and so. But today's first Sunday of Advent.
Theirs has not been Americanized like Christmas. By a
So-
Gregorian calendar. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so there we go. 4 Sundays of Advent, so it starts today. Now, the word Advent
Expectant. Oh, sorry.
comes from an old. So here's another true or false word for you.
I thought you were going to ask me.
True or false? The word Advent comes from an old Anglo-Saxon word meaning winter. True or false? False. It is false. What does Advent mean, and what does it come from?
Expectant. Am I right?
Close.
Oh, waiting.
Coming. Coming or approaching. And it is because it is the time in which we anticipate the coming of Jesus, not only the birth story of Jesus at Christmas, but also the second coming of Jesus. Advent is as much about the second coming of Jesus as it is preparing for Christmas, the day in which we celebrate when Jesus already came. So, Advent means coming, time of year we anticipate the coming of Christ. In our tradition, some of that is the American tradition, some of that is just the Christian tradition, we identify the 4 Sundays of Advent with a word. Can anybody name the 4 theme words of the 4 Sundays of Advent? If you want to help, the Advent wreath will help you.
Oh, come on. You're a pastor.
Say it again. Hope, joy, peace, and love. So each of these 4 Sundays that you're here, if you go to worship, if you've already been to worship at 8:30, if you go at 11, somebody or somebodies will light the Advent candle on the Advent wreath, and we'll say a word about what that candle represents and how those 4 things lead us to through the season of coming to Christmas. But this idea that we are to be reminded of the hope, the peace, the joy, the love that Christ brought and continues to bring into the world, and that we remember. So, hope, peace, joy, and love. Let's go back to the Advent wreath. most of you are familiar with an Advent wreath, since we use one in this tradition in our church. There are those 4 candles on the Advent wreath. 3 of them are what color? Purple. 1 of them is pink. You might know which candle is pink? Typically the 3rd candle is joy, and it marks just past the halfway point of Advent, and the continue to hold out hope that this will come in the joy of the season ahead. So there's really nothing overtly religious about the pink candle. It comes from other traditions, but it's something we use. But there is a 5th candle in the center that is what color?
White.
And what is that candle? Christ candle. So when do we light the Christ candle? Christmas Eve, the time right when Jesus would arrive. We wait until the moment of the triumphal arrival of the baby Jesus, and we light the Christ candle. And then if there's a Sunday, sometimes Christmas Day falls on a Sunday, and we're here on Christmas Day and keep the Christ candle lit. So we have 5 candles, that's what they represent. And then we have all 5 of those candles inside of an evergreen wreath, what does the wreath of Advent represent? Anybody know?
Keeps the candles from falling over.
It keeps the candles from falling over. And in case you were wondering,
I'm winning, for real.
and in case you're wondering, they can catch on fire. They do sometimes catch on fire, as they did in my last church one time. And here at Wilshire, we keep a fire extinguisher behind the pulpit. So, does the Advent wreath represent love, Jesus, the church, eternal life, or rejoicing?
Eternal life.
Eternal life. The unending circle, the evergreen circle.
I'm winning.
So there's some symbolism that's used. Again, it's not overly important to our Christian faith, but it's symbolic and it's meaningful during this time of the year. We've already mentioned that there are how many Sundays in Advent? 4. There's 4 Sundays. So we count Advent by Sundays, not by days. Here's a good one. Advent, this is either true or false for you. This is our second to last one, our penultimate question. Advent and Christmas is the last season of the church calendar, true or false?
False.
Why is it false? Because it is actually the first season of the Christian calendar. So last Sunday was, anybody remember what last Sunday was liturgically? Christ the King Sunday, which is the final Sunday of the Christian year. And then Advent, this Sunday, the first Sunday, it starts the Christian year all over again. And we start with the anticipation of the coming of Jesus. We go into Jesus' arrival, and then we go into Jesus' life. We get to Lent, and the preparation of Jesus' ministry, and then death and resurrection, and we go through the Christian cycle. And we get to Christ the King, where Christ reigns over all in a very different way than the world understood kings to reign. And then we go back to Christmas again and start over. So.
I have a question. In your dad's churches,
Yes.
in your granddad's churches,
Yes.
did they celebrate Advent back then?
I always grew up celebrating Advent. the
Oh,
way
you
we
did.
do,
You grew up
with an Advent wreath and the 4 Sundays. But the question you're getting to is that it is a lot of these are a more recent addition to the Christian life, particularly Protestant Christians, and particularly Baptist Christians. And so you may have grown up, or you may have even more recently been in churches where Advent was not really recognized. Christmas certainly was, but this time of preparation was not. But more and more so, Christians of all kinds are identifying this as an important part of the Christian year, given that it's not only the time leading to Christmas, but also this recognition of Jesus' coming again. And so, and just liturgy in general, the liturgical season is something that Protestant Christians are doing more with, whereas Catholics and even Episcopals have been doing more of that for a very long time. Okay, and this one is just a fun little, the last week of Advent is known as Holy Week, true or false? When is Holy Week?
The last one.
Right before Easter. So Holy Week is the week leading up to Easter. They're both purple seasons, but this one's a little bit different than that one. So, okay, great. So now you're all Advent experts. So when you go to worship or other places, you can tell people all these really important, meaningful things that you learned about Advent. But hopefully, though, that frames for you a little bit, why we have an Advent wreath, in the worship service what this season really is about, what this season is. It's now until Christmas, and it's really until Christmas Eve, actually, and then Christmas Day starts something else. Here's one last question. When are the 12 days of Christmas? After Christmas, starting on Christmas Day and the 12 days following. And then when in the Christian year, in the Christian cycle, do the wise men arrive? Epiphany, which is when? The first Sunday of January. And so there are plenty of Christmas story things that are continuing to happen even after Christmas Day. And so we at this church also recognize Epiphany Sunday. So January 6th will be the arrival of the Magi, the wise men, and Epiphany Sunday, where we talk about light conquering darkness, and what's that? And we have Christmas parties, some of us, or New Year's parties, right? Great. So this is the season that we're entering into, and what Mark has asked me to do today, and what you all are doing for the next 4 weeks, is looking at how the 4 independent gospel stories, what they say about this particular season, if anything, or what they tell us have to say about Jesus' life beyond this. But how do Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John influence, affect, teach us about the season of Advent, the season of Christmas, and what they say about Jesus' birth and life? So today we're starting at the beginning of the canon, which is Matthew. Matthew is not actually the first gospel written, but is the first gospel in the lineup of our Christian canon. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Another piece of trivia for you. There are only 2 of the gospels that actually discuss the birth narrative of Jesus. Which 2 gospels talk about Jesus' birth? Matthew. We're talking about Matthew today. And Luke. Luke is the one that we are most familiar with, perhaps, because it's the one that Linus Van Pelt comes out on stage in front of Charlie Brown and his friends and says his little line, which is why our dog is named Linus, by the way. It really is, because of that Linus, and because of that scene of that movie that I love. We know that story really well. But there are, and we're going to talk about Luke, or you all will talk about Luke in a couple of weeks, but there are some important differences between the story that Matthew tells and the story that Luke tells. But their meaning, their ultimate meaning for us is the same. There's a lot that people have studied about why Mark and John have left out the birth story. Mark begins with what? Does anybody know? In Jesus' life, where does Mark begin?
Baptism.
With Jesus' baptism. So everything before that is left out of Mark. But we started Jesus' baptism, which is an important part of Jesus' life. John begins where? In the beginning.
In the beginning, way back.
Was the word all the way in the very beginning, but then it jumps over the birth and the early part and gets there. So, but we have these 2 gospels these 2 writers who deemed this part of Jesus' life extremely important for our understanding of Christ even now. And so Matthew begins where? The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1, verse 1, the genealogy of Jesus, where Abraham begot Isaac, and Isaac begot, and there's just begotten, and begets, and all of those, all the way through to Jesus. So it's the lineage of Jesus, which I remember when I was young and reading this, it was the part that I always just skipped over. Well, let's just get to the good stuff where Jesus is born, right? Why would Matthew, a gospel writer, start a gospel with the genealogy, pretty much the complete genealogy of Jesus?
The Jewish influence.
So it has to do with Jewish influence. What else? So he's writing to a culture that understands, particularly patriarchal, paternal genealogy. This is the genealogy not through Mary, Jesus' biological mother, but through Joseph, who is not, in fact, Jesus' biological father. So why is that lineup of names, and who in that lineup of names would be most important, maybe we shouldn't say most important, but is key to the Jewish society? The lineup of Jesus, the genealogy. David. Why is David important in that lineup? David was the greatest king of all, as they understood him to be. And as Jewish culture understood the Messiah to be, the Messiah would have been who? reflect, or what?
A descendant of David.
So the descendant of David, who was to be the next future great king, the king of all kings. So they had this very regal, royal understanding of king, and that it would come from the line of David. So the genealogy of Jesus is to show that Jesus is actually in the line of David, yet is a king of a different kind. However, it is the genealogy of Joseph, who is not Jesus' biological father. So how then is it the genealogy of Jesus?
Son of man? No, that's the other side.
Say that again.
Adoption?
Adoption. So by law, in Jewish culture, by Joseph's accepting of Jesus as his own son, we would call it adoption now, legally that puts him in his own lineage and puts Jesus directly in the line of David by Joseph's adoption of Jesus. So the gospel story of Matthew focuses more on Joseph, whereas the gospel of Luke focuses primarily on Mary. So in the gospel of Luke, the scene that we know you see in Christmas pageants is the angel appearing to Mary and saying, "Mary, you're going to have a baby." And has anybody seen the animated cartoon that came out recently, the movie The Star, where it's the Christmas story from the perspective of the donkey? It's adorable. It's really funny. So we watched it over Thanksgiving with Bates's cousin is 10 months older than him. And so there's like a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old. And we're like, well, let's put on The Star for a little bit. But the adults are watching, and the part where the angel appears to Mary, it's like, oh, by the way, you're going to have this baby, and here's how that's going to happen, and you're not married yet, and you're a teenager, and this is really surprising. And Mary's just like, great, cool, sounds good. Let's get started. It's like, I don't think so. I don't think that's how that would have happened. I would have been freaking out if I was married. But that's an important part of the gospel story of Luke that is absent in the gospel story of Matthew. But there is an annunciation of another kind. An angel shows up to someone in the gospel of Matthew. To whom does an angel appear in the gospel of Matthew? Joseph. Why?
Joseph.
So say, look, man, you got to do this. But what was Joseph about to do? He was going to cut off Mary and cut off the marriage. This idea to marry Mary, because cultural influence, his own anxieties and fears and concerns, for a lot of reasons we could probably understand as people. But the angel appears and says, Joseph, I need you to hang on. You got to do this. You can do it. You will do it. It's all going to be okay. This is a really important thing that you have been chosen to do. And so the Gospel of Matthew's story really helps us understand the perspective of Jesus in relation to his legal father, his earthly father, who is Joseph. And then how Joseph's line leads back to David, and all of that's important. Okay, so there's a little bit of background information for the Gospel of Matthew as it pertains to Jesus' story. What else, if you can think about those two stories, if you know them well? This is just chapter 1 and chapter 2 in both Matthew and in Luke. That's where we are. So chapter 1 through the end of chapter 2. Chapter 1 being primarily the lineage of Jesus, and then chapter 2 being the story. But what is either missing or different from Matthew versus Luke? Anybody know? Where do Mary and Joseph live in the Gospel of Matthew? They don't live in Nazareth. They already live in Bethlehem, according to Matthew.
I was going to say that.
Yeah. So based on the reading of that part of Scripture, Matthew says they were already in Bethlehem living there. There is no room in the inn in Matthew because they didn't need an inn, they didn't need a manger, they lived there. Why in the Gospel of Luke do Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem? Because of the Emperor Augustus says all the world should be accounted for, go to your hometown. And so Joseph, being the line of David, is from Bethlehem, goes back there. But they live already in Nazareth. In Matthew, they live in Bethlehem, and they end up later living in Nazareth. You can worry about that all day long and think, oh my gosh, these two things don't make sense. They contradict one another.
Well,
That's not the importance of what we're looking at.
these were written
These were written from,
later and from, remember, and sometimes you get two people, you're gonna get two different
Right.
versions.
and it's extremely difficult to determine how these were put together, where that information could have come from. But what's not important is, where they live, whether or not they agree with those things, but the understanding of where some of these things took place. But there's just some interesting information. You start reading these stories that there are some differences. But what are the key similarities? And that's what we're going to focus on really with Matthew today, is what does Matthew then tell us about, and how is the message the same through Matthew and Luke, and then through all these Gospels? So part of what we need to address in any of these Gospels when we're dealing with Jesus is the identity of Jesus. So who is Jesus? So we've already addressed that Jesus is born to Mary, it's a virgin birth, he's adopted by Joseph. So somebody said earlier that by being born through Mary, Jesus is then fully human, in addition to being fully divine. So Jesus then becomes the Son of Man, as is called.
Son of man.
But being in the line of David means that Jesus is what they would call the Son of David, and in addition to being the Son of God. So let's back up a little bit and think about kind of how this helps guide us towards an understanding of where we are today. So in Matthew, we have, rather than the story of Augustus telling the whole world to be that the census taken, this story involves a different ruler, which is who? Who is the ruler in the Matthew story? Herod, King Herod. So King Herod is a pro-Roman king who's working under Augustus, but he's ruling this area where Jesus lives. And what is Herod's biggest fear in all of this story?
That this
He's gonna
individual
replace him.
will take
That
him.
his successor has arrived, and it's not who everybody thought it was, and there's this rival to his power, to his authority. So Jesus is born in Bethlehem. That part is the same. And who shows up in the Matthew story following Jesus' birth because of the star? Who are the people who show up? The wise men. So when we think about our nativity set, who's the nativity set? You have Matthew. You have Mary.
Oh, he might be there too.
He might be there too. You have Mary. You have depends on your nativity set. You have Joseph. You have the baby. You've got some animals maybe. You have wise men. You have shepherds.
Shepherds.
So the shepherds are a part of whose story? Luke's story. The Magi are a part of the wise men, or Matthew's story. So the nativity, the creche that we know it, is actually kind of a mashup of these two stories. So the wise men show up. Yep.
Well, and also the wise men didn't even show up until he was around 2 anyway.
Right.
So he wasn't.
Talking about January.
They weren't
right?
at the.
Epiphany,
Yeah.
later, right.
They weren't
In
at the
fact,
nativity.
where do they go first? Where do the wise men show up first?
They go to Herod.
They go to Jerusalem,
Right.
and they start saying, all right, where's the king? There's this new
Where's
king.
this
And it says that Herod and all of Jerusalem starts freaking out. I don't know what that looks like. But they're the ones who make it known to Herod that there is this new rival to Herod's authority. And it's a baby. But Herod's that fragile. So the wise men show up, and what does Herod do for the wise men? What does he ask the wise men to do?
He tells them to.
He's the one who says, go find this
Yeah,
baby
Go find him and come back.
and
Bring him to me.
bring him to me. I need this kid. But instead, the wise men go, they show up with their frankincense and myrrh and gold, which, by the way, we were in the old city of Jerusalem a couple weeks ago, and there's all these herb and spice shops all along the way, and they sold frankincense and myrrh, but there was a sign, the English translation got a little bit messed up, and instead of saying frankincense, it said Frank incense, as in Frank the name, his incense. It was like this possessive, like Frank's incense. I don't know if I want Frank's incense, but so they show up with these gifts, and instead of bringing baby back to Herod, what do?
They go back a different way.
They go back a different way, by a different route, and they deceive Herod because they want to protect this child, because they're wise, they understand who this is. So a part of the story that is often maybe not paid attention to is then where does Jesus and Mary, and where do they go after that? They go to Egypt. So we think about Jesus being in Nazareth and Bethlehem and Israel, and but Jesus, we don't actually know for how long, but Jesus, Joseph, and Mary fled to Egypt because they were afraid of what Herod would do, because what did Herod then say he was going to do and then do?
He did
All
do
the
it.
babies under 2 years.
All the babies under 2 years of age, which is out of control. Traumatizing, it's ridiculous. This person was, like I said, fragile, ill.
He couldn't get rid of his own family, so.
Yeah. So, in a sense, what we have to recognize is that in the Gospel of Matthew particularly, while they are identifying Jesus as this coming Messiah, this future king, Jesus starts his life with his family as a refugee. He flees the country of his birth and his origin and has to hide out in Egypt until they feel like it's safe to come back. Except when they try to come back and go to Judea, you might know who's ruling Judea when they come back? Not Herod. Who is who? Who
He's the
is
son of Herod.
He's Herod's son. And so they, well, we don't want to go back and hang out with Herod's son. So then they go to Galilee. And so in Matthew's story, that's when they end up in Nazareth, in the Galilee region, where they are outside the reign of Herod or Herod's son. And then they start their life again in Israel. But for a time, they are refugees in Egypt. So we talked about the importance of the Jewish culture and understanding of the time. And part of why the genealogy would have started is, and the way the gospel starts in Matthew, is to tie what's now happening in what we now know as the New Testament to the only scripture of the day, which is the Old Testament. So who in the Old Testament that you can think of has also fled to Egypt or has fled and been refugees in other places? So we've got Moses, we've got Joseph, so it is interesting if you start paying attention. In fact, let me read this to you. So this is a guy named Raymond Brown, who's a really important biblical scholar. He wrote this book of Coming Christ and Advent. And he talks about how these stories line up with one another. So he says, then in a double exposure technique, Matthew's story of the conception and birth of Jesus reenacts the story of Israel's deliverance from Egypt. Joseph, the father of Jesus, is deliberately reminiscent of the Old Testament Joseph as he receives revelation in dreams and goes to Egypt, thus saving the family. The wicked King Herod is a carbon copy of the wicked Pharaoh who killed the Hebrew male children, only to have God protect the life of the one who would save his people, Moses, Jesus. In the story of Moses, the Magi Balaam come from the east and saw the star of the Davidic king rise from Israel, in Numbers 22 through 24. So too, after Jesus' birth, Magi come from the east, having seen the star of the king of the Jews. Pretty wild, right? Does that bother you? Or does that excite you in some way, that those stories parallel so closely?
Never thought about those.
No.
Never thought about that.
What bothers me is if you belong to an ethnic group of people who've been held prisoner in a country, you're going to go back to that country?
Yeah. Interesting, huh?
And I know there's no archaeological data saying that the Moses story ever happened. That doesn't matter. They believed it.
Yeah. And we've been to those places. And there's a lot that lines up with the story of Moses. But it is, so what does that parallel help us then to know about who Jesus is for the Jewish people? The fact that Jesus' own origin story matches so closely the story of the Israelite people from all those years ago, what does that then further do for Jewish society? Sorry? So it helps to say, this is that person that has been prophesied for so long, and his own story matches yours as a way to say, I am one of you, I am with you, but I am the coming of the next part of the story. I am the completion of that next beginning. The new covenant is what Jesus often refers to and talks about.
Ryan, what do you make of
fact that this story about the wise men is only in this one gospel. I mean, do we know that those children were killed? Is that a fact?
From that historical record, yeah. And again, so these are different perspectives of a similar story, or the same story. You know, it's one of those things where we have to use our best historical information and scholarly information, and also our best understanding of kind of biblical truth to recognize kind of the importance of some of these figures. But I think what is recorded, what is historically accurate, is that there were these magi that have been over time developed into these kings who rode on camels and
Weren't
had
they
these.
just the opposite? Weren't
Right.
they very poor?
They were wise men. It was really much more accurate. They were
Wasn't
magi.
three, there was probably way more than three, but
Yeah, I mean, they were
very
just
poor.
they're sages of sorts.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is record of this happening, and that's what it traces back through into Matthew's gospel. But what is also helpful to understand, though, is that just like Matthew talks about a star and the Magi responding, and Luke talks about the star and the shepherd responding. What that's helping us to understand is that the message of who this is coming into the world was being spread immediately from the beginning. That it wasn't just Joseph and Mary who were keeping the secret, that right away there were other people of significance who were a part of the beginning of the story and knew the story and began to tell the story. So you have the shepherds in Luke, you have the Magi in Matthew, who from the very beginning are proclaiming, or other people proclaiming this as the Messiah, and then also telling that story. So you have bystanders to this story.
There was also an Old Testament quote that said, for I can't think of her name, but she was crying because of the children that had been killed.
Yeah.
And that referred back to this.
I mean, we have a lot of record of Herod's reign. Historically, there is record of, and a lot of what Herod built and did is still there. I mean, we saw that just a few weeks ago. So there's a lot of historical, biblical or otherwise, historical data about the time of Herod. So, but let me read you what else the last part of what Raymond Brown has to say about that parallel between this Old Testament Israelite story and then Jesus' story. That the fulfillment of the law and the prophets may be seen as an introduction to what God will do through Jesus when the gospel proper begins with the baptism at the Jordan. And so there just continues to be this continuation of the story, that the reason that Matthew would begin with Abraham, the lineage of Jesus, and begin the Gospel of Matthew with Abraham, is to say that the story of Jesus begins with Abraham. That Jesus is not the story of Jesus is not this separate part of the story, but that all of this is leading up to when the Messiah comes to the world, and that Abraham and the story of the Israelites and the Hebrew people at that time is actually the beginning, the very, very, very beginning of Jesus' story. That all of that is leading to this time, but that it took all of that time, all of that anticipation. So we anticipate for 4 weeks before Christmas. We see Christmas lights, in October sometimes. I don't know. But this is a group of people who, for lifetimes, have been anticipating what is happening, and so this is significant for these people, for the world, ultimately. So that's what we have to keep in mind.
Is there any historical proof that those wise people were all men? I can see at least a woman was a
It's a patriarchal society, and so a lot of what you see in writing is about men. It could be that there were, and this is just my own speculation, but there could have been females a part of that sage group. There are a lot of women who are omitted from historical writings, biblical writings, just because of the patriarchal society. So when we were in Magdala, which is where Mary Magdalene would have been from, there's a church that's built there, and in the atrium of the narthex of the church, there are columns that surround the room. And on each column is an important biblical heroines' names. So, it'd be Mary and Ruth and others. But there's one column that's left blank on purpose, and it's for all the unnamed female figures in the Bible and all those who have yet to come who are important to the story. So it may be that there were women involved where there aren't women listed. Part of that's men writing from a male-dominated society, and women having a different role in that particular view. So,
But there's 4 women mentioned in the genealogy.
right, out of how many men? But the fact that they're mentioned means that they are women of great importance in some way. So there's a lot of study about those particular women too, which is interesting. Okay, so we're doing okay. There's a lot of information here. We had who was it recently I was working with, and there was somebody who was trying to teach something, and every now and then they would stop and say, all right, we good? Everybody's blood sugar okay? We take a deep breath and you get something to eat? We good? And I thought that was a funny way to keep going. So, let me say a little more about, so then what is this Gospel of Matthew helping us to know, not just about Jesus' birth, but about Jesus' life and about what we are to understand today in relationship with who Jesus is and was. Okay, so it is important for the fulfillment of this prophecy, fulfillment of Jewish understanding, that Jesus be identified as the son of David. And so Matthew makes a strong point to say, there it is. Here's the genealogy. Here's the history. Here are some of the parallels that go back. A lot of times in the Gospels they will reference, the Old Testament scriptures. So they need to identify Jesus as the son of David. But also what is more important for the rest of humanity is to identify Jesus as the Son of God, as the Messiah. And so the rest of Jesus' life is really about the proclaiming of being the Messiah. And so the birth is about people saying, well, this is him, or some people saying this is the Messiah, but others, and the Jewish society understanding that this would need to be somebody in the line of David, and so we've done that. But then so much of Jesus' life is to say that I am who I am, that I am this Son of God. And so we do that through understanding all the rest of the Scripture. So with Mark starting with the baptism of Jesus, well, what happens at the baptism of Jesus? Who speaks on behalf of Jesus at that moment? God does. The clouds part and the doves come down, and so this is my son, and is named as Son of God. And so in the gospel story, we are continuously seeing Jesus have to be identified in different ways. So when you go to the story of the disciples and Jesus saying to them, who do you say that I am? And they're having to answer that question. Well, what is Peter's response?
Messiah.
You're the Messiah. So they're having to keep naming Jesus as this figure because for so many they were anticipating just a figure of a different kind. They were anticipating the next actual David, the king. And so Messiah, does anybody know what Messiah means? Literally translated from the Hebrew. Anointed one. So when a king is anointed, how is that done? Do you know?
With oil.
With oil. You're pouring oil over the head. And so with David, who was it that anointed David? Remember? Samuel is the one who anoints the person king because the Israelites are saying, everybody else is a king, we want a king. And so Samuel talks to God and they figure that out and say, all right, well, if that's what they want, we'll give them David. Or we'll give them Saul first. Sorry, we'll give them Saul first. And then we give them David, and then we give them Solomon, and we move on. So they anoint Saul first, and they anoint David. And so Saul was a train wreck. David was much better. They're waiting for the next David, who will literally be this anointed person, this grown man who's anointed with oil, but instead it's a baby born in a manger. And so there has to be this continual identifying Jesus as all of these things that they expected this Messiah to be. But Jesus comes and is counter to much of what they're expecting. So let's go back and talk about Jesus as a refugee. Because I think that's where the story conflicts with itself, not in understanding who Jesus is, but in the Jewish understanding of who Jesus is and who Jesus actually came and was. That rather than be this mighty king who ruled and did all these things that kings were supposed to do, Jesus was essentially homeless, itinerant. He was a refugee a lot of the time. He was working with people with whom others wanted nothing to do anything with. And understanding that Jesus began his life fleeing from violence and oppressed by a particular king and living as a refugee helps us understand perhaps then how Jesus spent the rest of his life saying, that's the kind of person that I'm going to spend a lot of my time paying attention to, is those who are least lost, and to use language of today, oppressed, fleeing violence, marginalized, and those things. So we residents talk with George a lot about how anytime that you talk about the gospel, you are talking about the things that can conflict with realities of the day. And that's, the gospel is a radical story in a lot of ways. And so a lot of times when we talk as Christians about these things of faith, it can feel political even when it's not meant to be. Because a lot of times those things clash with politics of the day. So how might the reality of our world today be shaped by our understanding of Jesus as a refugee? And I prefaced all that to say this is not a political statement, but a gospel statement. How is it that how is helping us, how is knowing that Jesus started his life as a refugee, fled to Egypt, how does that help influence our understanding of faith and Jesus and Christianity today and how we live?
Part of that would have to be that the refugee situation is at least it's at a peak that I can remember during my lifetime.
Yeah.
And it happens to be now, coming from many different countries. So that analogy can easily be drawn, it would seem.
There are more than a few refugees in our world today.
More than a few.
And so, politics aside, as much as we can do that, how we respond to people who are in need, refugees or not, can be influenced by the fact that there was a time in Jesus' life where they were a family in need and they were a family on the run.
That when we heard, and George mentioned it this morning, or he will mention it in the next. Garland, when the gentleman spoke from down there, the pastor of the church in San Antonio.
Yeah.
That was really.
Yeah, so
insightful.
What Mike's referencing is at Deacon's meeting last week, they invited a Mennonite pastor in San Antonio to talk about his work with refugees and with those who are being released from detention centers along the border. And he was just talking about just some of their stories, some of the work they do, some of how we as a church can respond, and was saying this to the deacon body. And it was just a very meaningful, very moving, very powerful testimony of just how to respond to some of these people who essentially are refugees or just people who are struggling to just pursue their life because they're fleeing violence, they're fleeing persecution. And again, politics layer on top of that, but that aside, there are people who are in need and there's a way to respond differently. So one way to look at this is to say, even the birth story of Jesus, the gospel of Jesus, can help us think about a Christian response to refugee crises that happen in the world, because Jesus started his life technically as a refugee. So the other thing, because I know we're out of time, the other thing to tell you about and to kind of close the loop on is that we talked at the beginning about Jesus being the line of David through adoption. And so there's this sense, in the larger kind of Christian study, that's extremely important, that says the covenant with the original Hebrew people, the Israelites, was not done away with when this new covenant started with the Christian church. There is a really important distinction to be made that says that the church is not the replacement of, the Christian church is not the replacement of an original covenant with an original group of people, yet this is a new group of people who would have been considered Gentiles in the day. Those not born into Jewish life, Gentiles, are adopted into that original covenant, and that covenant is then continued in a new way through the adoption of all people into that story. That Jesus, by coming as the Son of David, as the Son of God, came to say all people are adopted into the family of God and have membership into this new covenant. And so it is important to recognize that Jesus' adoption speaks then later to our adoption of sorts into this family of God, as Jesus was done into the family of David. And that by identifying Jesus as both Son of David and Son of God, it is sending a message to all people in different ways and in layered ways. And so our recognition that there is a covenant that was created with a particular group of people, it was extended through adoption by Jesus and with God to all those, Jew or Gentile, and all those who are considered children of God. So there are just layers upon layers to the story that help us understand more about Jesus, help us understand more about the history of the Old Testament, more about how we can then understand and live into the world today. We only have a little bit of time. We're done. There's more we can say about that. You all will talk about Mark, Luke, and John in the next few weeks. But hopefully this helps you think about these scriptures and this Christmas story in a very different or new way. So thank you for...
Thank you.
I do want to set the record straight, though.
Sure.
There was actually 4 wise men, and he brought a fruitcake, and they wouldn't let him get on the table.
Yeah, and we're still trying to get fruitcake into people's hands.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my God.
So if they had built a wall, Jesus would have been screwed.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Well, and there's a wall around Bethlehem
Oh,
today.
yeah, that's why they're making structures from bricks.
Yeah, so anyway, just all of this transcends time and carries over. We have to interpret and study and think and determine and keep our faith in the right place. So, well, thank you all. I hope that's helpful. It's helpful for me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Always good to be with you. Yeah, sure.
So we'll say bye to live stream.
Yeah, thank you for those who are live streaming. See you later. Happy Advent. Prayer concerns, prayer thoughts as we close.